Hello, this is Dr. Moyer, and this is the PowerPoint on the Introduction to Poverty. I did also post this without a narrative so that you can print out the PowerPoints if you want the slides and the notes, and then either add notes or at least have access to them without having to go through the whole YouTube movie. So, how many Americans live in poverty? And I should mention that this class focuses primarily on American poverty. We will talk about some other factors in other developed countries like America, but for the most part we're going to be focusing on American poverty. Mostly because many people are unaware of how serious the situation is. So it's about 1 in 6 Americans living in poverty. Well, that may not seem like a lot to you. Maybe 15% of the population doesn't seem like a lot to you. But you should care about poverty, and I'll tell you why. First of all, poverty affects child development in very serious ways. The research is very clear about this. And this is the next generation of citizens. They'll be running the country and taking care of us. So that is one of the biggest reasons that you should care. Another big reason is that most of the people that live in poverty are vulnerable populations. So they are children, the elderly, people living with any type of disability, and people that are, I want to say, not vulnerable, but, and not at risk, but just hanging off the ledge. They're just barely making it. They're at risk because any little thing can thrust them into poverty. Some type of medical emergency, loss of a job, something major with their house or living situation, even having to fix a car, a major, something going wrong with the car, that's pretty serious. So a lot of people, it's about 65% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, and that makes them very much at risk, because if you can't save money, you're not prepared if something happens. And when people have to tap into emergency funding, they oftentimes do things that are not family resource management friendly, such as maxing out credit cards, or getting one of the quick loans that have a really high percentage if you don't pay, of interest if you don't pay them back. People get desperate. As far as the effects on child development, I'm just going to highlight some of the major things in these areas. With parent-child relationships, research shows that when parents are living in poverty, they don't spend as much time with their children. They don't listen to their children as closely as they would if they weren't living in poverty, and they don't make as much eye-to-eye contact. They also don't read to their children as often and have fewer books in the house, making it even more difficult to encourage reading skills among children, which affects academic achievement. Reading is one of the best ways that you can help children to become more knowledgeable, better writers, better readers, etc. Then with brain development, most of the major brain development occurs before the age of 3. And unfortunately, the most vulnerable of people living in poverty are children under the age of 3 because of this. And so if children aren't getting adequate nutrition, they're not getting adequate care, they're not getting the types of experience that help with brain development, even worse, they're being abused in some way, then that's going to affect their brain development. Lots of families that struggle with poverty struggle with addiction, and the environment with addiction can be very detrimental to brain development. So even smoking cigarettes in the home can be detrimental to brain development. And so as far as environment, not only with addictions, but research shows that children growing up in areas of high poverty tend to grow up in chaotic environments. so they don't stick to a regular schedule. There's more stress. A lot of times there's crime, there's more fighting. And so the environment is not always the most healthy. Emotional development, learning how to control our emotions, learning how to express our emotions. When children grow up in poverty, they don't have as much experience or knowledge about controlling their emotions. Many times they don't even get to learn that from their parents. Friendships, children living in poverty have fewer friendships, and they have fewer children over to their home. Impulse control tends to be more poor among children that live in poverty, so they have less control over their impulses. And then the mental and the physical health. Of course, the physical health, if you're living in poverty, you don't have access to high quality health care. Virtually every child in America should have access to health care, but it may not necessarily be the best circumstances for them, and mental health is often overlooked. There's one thing that, as I'm going through this list, should have jumped out at you as a common factor, which is time. Time is a very precious commodity for parents and children living in poverty. There's just not a lot of time. If you're having to commute to work, that can take a long time. I remember having to, when I didn't have a car and I lived in Bangor, Maine, I would have to commute about an hour to get to a job that would take me probably 10 minutes if I could drive there. But I had to switch buses, had to wait for the bus, had to walk down to where the bus picked me up. All these factors meant that every day there were 2 hours added onto my day, my work day, because of the commute. And I know many families struggle with a much bigger commute. There's also the issue of having to work more than one job or working overtime to try to make ends meet. If you don't have a lot of time, you don't have the time to sit there and listen carefully to a child as they're talking to you and looking them in the eye, reading them books, because you're struggling to get everything done, dinner on the table. And most of the time we're talking about single-parent households as well, where there's not another partner to help out with these things. So, time, very precious commodity. Oftentimes, too, we also expect families living in poverty to prepare meals on a budget. We don't allow a lot for help if families do qualify for SNAP benefits, which are like food stamps. We expect them to be able to prepare meals. Well, if you cook, you know that preparing a meal takes a long time. And if you don't have time, then that makes it even more challenging. Why is it so hard to get out of poverty? Well, because there are so many interrelated forces that affect one's life in living in poverty, it makes it very difficult to get out. So it's not like you can just help with one thing and then everything else is resolved. So in communities with large shares of the population living in poverty, that oftentimes facing situations where the public school systems are not as high quality as they would prefer. It's hard to attract good teachers, hard to have resources. Many times, some schools you can't even take home the books, making it much more difficult. And if you can't attract the good teachers, then it's really hard. If there's a high student to teacher ratio, it makes learning more difficult too. Good jobs are often very scarce in populations, in communities where a large share of the population is living in poverty. Medical facilities are scarce, and when they do exist, they're overcrowded. What you see on the picture now is not uncommon. People will have to wait in line oftentimes all day just to be treated for like an ear infection, bronchitis, something where they actually do require intervention, but they just can't afford to go anywhere else. Public health departments, free clinics are often seen. You see long lines like this. There's also oftentimes high crime. People living in poverty will struggle with paying bills and oftentimes get desperate. It may seem like it's easy to just sell drugs to gain some extra money or to steal something, but having an area living in high crime has its effect on the people living there. Not only those that are victims of crime, but everyone else around it as well. Having to live in dilapidated housing. So even if there is public housing or low-income housing available, oftentimes it's not the best quality. And that has an effect on one's well-being. I mean, I think about this picture here of this house. And if I was coming home to that every day, where I did actually grow up living in a house that wasn't that great. And it does affect your mental health. When I would visit friends that had really nice houses, I would think, oh, their life must be so easy. It's so pretty in here. It smells good. The floors are nice. The yard is nice. And then I would go home and it just really has a negative effect on your well-being. And just fewer resources overall. So even if there are things like food pantries, there's not enough to go around, and there's certainly not enough to provide for adequate nutritious meals that help the child with the developing brain. And so I go over all these just to help you understand that it's not just a matter of, oh, I'll give this family money and they'll be out of poverty. There's so many other factors that are interrelated. It makes it very difficult to just get out. So we have to measure poverty because we have to know how many people are living in poverty. That helps us determine how many resources are needed, how much of the budget needs to be put towards helping families living in poverty. So this is kind of, a joke, obviously. So here you have this guy, the census taker, but factor in the food stamps and the earned income tax credit and the fact that you own the vehicle you live in, plus the rollover minutes on your cell phone. Yep, you're middle class. It's sort of silly, but that's kind of what we're seeing now is families that used to be middle class are actually struggling, and oftentimes many find themselves homeless. And how we measure poverty is not perfect. And this comic demonstrates that. As I talk about it, you'll understand better why it's not perfect, but you can't just look at numbers on a sheet and say, okay, you live in poverty or you don't live in poverty, but that's what we do. We use what is called the absolute measures of poverty, and it's just a formula that was developed in the 1950s. It was based on a food survey conducted by Moyer and was based on how much money families needed to prepare meals or how much of their budget they used, and made assumptions that families had time to make meals from scratch and to store materials and to cook in bulk. Well, in the 1950s, 1960s, that wasn't really uncommon. Nowadays, we have more convenience foods available, but that's much more costly. And so we have this income line. It's what is usually referred to, poverty line, income line, poverty threshold. Just a line where you're either in poverty or you're not. And what's nice about it is statistically it makes sense because we can track poverty over time in a consistent manner. So the major pro would be the statistical advantage. The cons, well, it's not really a fair way to measure it because where people live and how much help they have from family and friends all affect whether one's living in poverty, but we don't consider factors like that. So consider family A, family B. Family A, family B make the same amount of money, have the same amount of members in their family, and live in the same area. And so on paper, they look the same and say they're both living in poverty. But family A has lots of extended family around and as a result, has free childcare because one of the mothers, the parent, watches the children for free, and maybe hand-me-down clothing is given to the family. Family meals are held often at maybe a matriarch's home, and that provides a big meal. Or any help at all given by extended family. That is not, if the same, family B doesn't have the same situation, doesn't have extended family around that can help them like that, so they don't have these in-kind benefits coming in, but they're given the same amount of aid. And so that can be really confusing. Lots of times we witness things like, let's say a family, you're working in a child care setting, which wouldn't be uncommon for an FCS professional, and you notice that a parent that drops off their child and qualifies for free child care is driving a really nice vehicle, maybe even has a really nice cell phone. And this can be, and I hear this kind of thing all the time in the classroom, and this can be incredibly frustrating because your assumption is, wow, they can afford this great car and this cell phone, but they're getting free childcare. I am struggling. I don't have the nice car, the nice cell phone. I have to pay for my childcare. Well, you don't know everyone's story. And I'm not saying that some people do abuse the system, but it's a small percent of people that receive help that actually do the abusing. So the majority are people that need the help and use it accordingly. In fact, the biggest cause of fraud are vendors that abuse the system and try to find ways to get paid more for things that they're providing people living in poverty. Anyways, back to the SUV driving, cell phone carrying parent. We don't know that car wasn't given to them by a family member, or that they're borrowing a friend's, or that it is a family member's vehicle. We also don't know about the cell phone and how it's obtained. Sometimes phones are provided as part of someone's job. It doesn't mean they're paid a whole lot. Or it could have been purchased by someone else. Tax refund money could have been used to purchase these things. And although that may not be the decision that you would make, that's one of the problems, is that people don't have financial literacy and don't know how to make good decisions like that. Okay, so enough with that. The poverty guidelines for 2015, I haven't pulled them up for 2016 yet. We will be going by the 2015 guidelines. And so this is showing that for a family of 4 has to make $24,250 or less per year before taxes in order to qualify for aid. And so that really doesn't amount to very much. For a family of 4, that means one adult working full-time has to make at least $11.66 per hour in order for the family to live at the poverty line. More if they want to live above it. And so I showed you the formula for how I figured that out. The federal minimum wage is still $7.25 per hour. It's more in Illinois and other states, but the federal level, which is what all states have to abide by, is still $7.25 per hour. And many argue this isn't even enough for one adult, which many times there are single-parent households relying on one parent's income. And if you are not qualified or don't have a college degree, don't have the skills, and all you can find are minimum wage paying jobs, the point is you can't even make enough to get out of poverty. You should know that FCS experts say families need at least double the poverty threshold to survive and thrive. So if you take the guidelines, multiply by 2, which is 200%, then that's where we would get $48,500 for a family of 4. And there is a video, how would you budget? You should check it out on the PowerPoint yourself. The one without the narrative, you can click on the link. And it's basically just a short, I think 3 or 4 minute video that shows how families struggle with budgeting when they're not making much money. Another way to measure poverty, but we don't typically use this, is a relative measurement, which is defined by possessions that one lacks in a particular culture. So, for example, in the United States, if you didn't have a phone, or you didn't have a home, or even a car, depending on where you live, then that could make getting and keeping a job difficult. So, in many places, we would equate the lack of these items with poverty. The pros and cons, it's a much more accurate assessment of poverty. So that would be a major pro. The con, of course, would be that it's difficult to measure poverty in this way and to compare it across time and across geographic areas because it's going to differ. And that makes it not a happy statistical situation. When you want to have statistics and be able to measure and say this many people, it's hard to do that if you use a relative measure. As for the causes of poverty, there are 3 general causes: structural, individualistic, and situational. What I do want to say about these is that no one cause is the only cause of poverty. Poverty is complicated. You should have realized that by now. And typically it's a combination of these causes that result in families living in poverty. So you can't point to one thing, which makes it even more difficult because how can we prevent something when the causes are so complicated? So structural causes of poverty, and this is also in your textbook. And I've put up what you need to know. I'm not going to read the PowerPoints to you. You can do that. But these are the examples. The effect of the economy, inadequate government assistance, the growing inequality of wages by level of education, and then some reasons why that's happening, discrimination and prejudice. And this is something that continues to affect how much money people make, how much they're able to make, whether they live in poverty or not. And the buzzword now is intersectionality. And what this means is that individuals, families, or groups fall into more than one of these categories, making it even more complicated. And so you may not just be struggling with sexism, you may also be struggling with racism or ableism. And so, of course, the more of these isms that one has, the greater the likelihood that they would be living in poverty and being discriminated against. Individualistic causes, on the other hand, are factors that have been blamed or poverty's been attributed to. And this is a theory, so I don't want to get into too much of this. I don't want you guys to focus on this as being the only cause, but these can result in an individual being unable to work or not able to earn a great deal of money. So, situational causes of poverty, something usually we're able to wrap our mind around very easily and imagine ourselves in a situation like that. So these are all kinds of things that can happen. As I indicated in the beginning of the PowerPoint, if 65% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, then a situation that comes along like this can thrust them into poverty, and that happens a lot. And it's very difficult to climb back out. Some families are able to do it, some are not. It's unfortunate that it's that way, but it is that way, and that's why people need to do some long-term planning. That concludes the lecture on poverty. I apologize, I know it's a little dark and bleak, and this class can be a little bleak and disheartening, but you're learning, and learning is always the beginning. You become aware, you become educated, share the knowledge. Okay.